Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Get in Tune. I'm Michael Gracia, and I got some rings in my eyes here. Let's see if I can just get them out a little bit here. Okay, whatever. It's better. So thank you all for coming on tonight. I have a wonderful show planned. I am excited for tonight. I've actually had a lot of people, I'd say a good maybe 6 people who have written me about tonight's show saying how they are very excited because one of the major topics we're going to talk about is the Twilight Zone and this book here written by our guest. But in addition to this book, our guest, Arlen Schumer, who'll be on in a second, he's super knowledgeable about pop culture, comics, you name it, this guy knows it. And if you know me, and I've talked about this a couple of times on the show, so sometimes during the day or when I'm in my studio and I'm just doing artwork, I like to put YouTube videos on. And I found Arlen's videos, and I am obsessed with his videos, specifically on the Silver Age comics, which he has a book about, and we will talk about tonight because I need to get a copy. So, without further ado, let's bring on Arlen Schumer. Hello,
hey,
Arlen. How you doing?
Michael? Great. So great to be here. What a great intro. I love it.
Thank you. No, I meant every word. I really am obsessed with your videos. I have watched the Gil Kane one a couple of times now because I'm a big Gil Kane fan.
Really? What was your Gil Kane work that first affected you?
When I was, I was always a Green Lantern fan, and growing up, I got into collecting comics when I was 13, so that was 1989.
Way after Gil Kane.
Yeah, exactly.
Lantern Ran.
I started trying to read older stuff. It was probably the early to mid 90s. I think it was one of those reprint books, like they reprinted issue, and I really just enjoyed it. And I started looking for older books. And I mean, you can't see it now, but I have a bunch of the DC showcases. They're covered up if I move my camera.
Well, that's early Kane.
Yeah. And I love reading the black and white stuff. I'm colorblind, so seeing just the line work is really cool to me. Yeah. So, but yeah, no, and I drew like him so much. And a few other artists like Alex Toth is a big influence on me, Kirby. I mean, anybody from that era, Will Eisner,
greats.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up reading obviously comic strips before comic books, and I got into like like Flash Gordon, the Phantom.
You got into comic strips before comic books?
Yes, because how my father had the newspaper, and my parents got.
Yeah, but Flash Gordon wasn't in the newspapers when you were reading them.
He was where I grew up, he wasn't, but in the city newspapers, in the Daily News, he was in there early.
But not like the classic Alex Raymond.
No, not the classic, but I enjoyed those adventure strips, and then. In the 80s, they had the Defenders of the Earth cartoon, which I grew up on.
When did you discover comic books?
In 1986, I was reading some books that my cousin had. But it wasn't until 89 that I was like, I want to collect, that I want to start getting into it. Because I was always a strip guy, Peanuts, Calvin and Hobbes, Beetle Bailey, Hagar. I mean,
the humorous daily strips, but not the realistic adventure strips.
They didn't really have those in there. I mean, the Phantom still played, but Dick Tracy.
You were attracted to the cartoonier strips.
Oh yeah,
daily gag-a-day panel strips.
Yeah, a lot of that. But I did.
Listen, I grew up with the Bergen Record in New Jersey, and it had all the daily. That's the revolution that Schultz started with Peanuts, was the gag-a-day, cartoonier strips, because in the 50s and 40s and 30s, it was more the adventure strip, of the Alex Raymonds and, all that stuff. Hal Foster and Prince Valiant and, et cetera. Yeah. Right.
But I got into it. And then as I started learning about artists, and it was one of those things where, like, specifically the '90s was a big era of comics for me. And when I look back, I wasn't a huge fan of what came out of the '90s. But when I would look at artists that I enjoyed, and I would try to learn about the artists, I would want to look at the artists that they looked at. And you look at somebody like Romita Sr. and Buscema, and they were looking at Hal Foster and Alex Raymond.
Of course, and Kniff. There were the three, the trinity of comic strip artists: Hal Foster, Milton Kniff, and Alex Raymond. Those were the three schools, and all the comic artists of the Silver Age all came out of one school or the other. Kubert came out of, Foster. Buscema came out of Foster. Other artists came out of, Toth came out of Kniff.
Yeah.
And the black and white, chiaroscuro look. Yeah.
And speaking of Kniff, one of my teachers was Richard Rockwell, who was his inker.
Yes.
Steve Canyon. And then when Kniff passed away, he finished the strip.
Really? See, and I was never a big fan of comic strips. I was the opposite. I came into comic books first. And but I love the daily strips and Charlie Brown and all that stuff. But yeah, it was the Silver Age superhero comics that most influenced me growing up.
Yeah, and there was a book too. I think it was called the Great Comic Book Super.
Yeah, by Jules Pfeiffer. That was the first history book, 1965.
And
yeah,
it was. Well, this is when I first saw old comics.
Right, most of us did.
I was at the cartoon museum that they used to have in Portchester, New York.
Yes, the original version of that.
9 years old. There was a Bob Kane exhibit. I remember it was the first time I saw that comics were created so much larger. And I got my first cartooning book there, which was Jack Ham's cartooning the Head and Figure.
No.
And I got a few things there, but that was where I first saw it. And then again, it was in my high school library, and I took that book out countless times, and I would just copy and trace out of it. And yeah, I loved it. So I really got into classic golden and silver age stuff, but I really feel the Silver Age was my era of comics.
But that's interesting. It was before your time, but it became your primary interest. Well, that's the sign of great art, that it can not only be of its time, but stand the test of time and continue to influence. The way I describe those great Silver Age artists is that the same way we look back on the great Renaissance masters like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael, I believe 500 years from now, Michael, future art historians are going to look back at our great artists of the human figure, the Jack Kirby's, Joe Kuberts, Neil Adams, Jim Steranko, basically all the artists in my book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. Yeah,
absolutely. Speaking of your book, I want to give you the screen real quick. Can you show the cover so everyone can see it?
Yeah, absolutely. The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. It's the only coffee table art book that's about the artwork. And I even take out the original word balloon text and put the artist talking about the artwork. So like on this spread, I'm showing you the origin of what's called Kirby Crackle, the energy emissions that come from Galactus's and Doctor Doom's hands. And like the image of Doctor Doom over the surfer, I describe in my comments that it's not only one of the greatest examples of victory and defeat in a single image, and not only the history of comics, but I would say the history of art itself.
Yeah.
End of shameless plug. Right?
Yeah. We got a comment from our mutual friend and friend of the show.
There he is, the fifth Beatle, Ray Felix. Thank you, Ray.
Thanks for tuning in, Ray. We appreciate it. You guys in the audience, I know we got a few people watching right now. If you have any questions for me or Arlen, please make sure you drop them in the comments. I'll make sure I do my best to ask.
And by the way, everybody can get a signed hardcover of my book just by going to my website. But I'm sure you'll give all the links at the end.
I will give all the links. I have them. Actually, Let me just, I have to type that one in because I didn't, it's arlenschumer.com, correct?
Right. And then once you get to my website, you'll see there's separate pages for my books and all my other pop culture interests.
Let me throw that right there. I threw it in the comments. And
But now I want to know about your Twilight Zone background.
oh, well, that we were going to get to that. But before we get to the Twilight Zone, I want people to learn a little bit more about you and just give us a little more of your background. How did you become a pop culture historian? How did you fall in love with all these things?
Well, first of all, I grew up not with children's books. My mother never read to my brother and I, stuff like that. The first visual image I can recall looking at a black and white TV set, I must have been 4.5 years old, was the black and white Twilight Zone eyeball.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the fact that I would end up doing a coffee table art book about the Twilight Zone with that eyeball image embossed on the front cover, that should say it all, right?
Yeah.
You can make a direct line. But my mother was a widow. She raised my brother and I herself. My father died when I was 4 months old. So she sent us to sleepaway camp for 2 months. Back then, that was a long time.
Yeah.
When I was like 5 years old, 6 and 7, very young, in order that we would get father figures from the counselors in camp, because my mother was hearing in her ear all the relatives, Lucy, the boys need father figures. Send them to summer camp with the counselors. Well, it was in summer camp in the early 60s. Strewn around the bunks were comic books everywhere. And it was mostly superheroes, Marvel and DC. There were some Betty and Veronica, Archie comics, but it was mostly those superheroes. And that's where I discovered Batman, and I was drawn to the Superman. There was that Silver Age annual in 1963 with Superman painted on the cover to look like a statue.
Yes.
It was actually Kurt Swan's pencils with the head of DC coloring, Jack Adler, who happens to be Howard Stern's, I think, not uncle, maybe older cousin, who would bring Howard all those comics in the late 50s and 60s, which is why Howard is a comic book fan. But I digress. But that's the first comic book image I can recall seeing, is that incredible annual cover in the summer of 63. So comic books, I think the superheroes were the father figures that by proxy, became father figures. Superman, Batman, and Rod Serling in the Twilight Zone was a father figure. And then as I got older, and I was always drawing since I was a kid, like my brother, copying the comics, Gil Kane, the artist that you love, all those Silver Age artists were the artists of my youth. And I was just at the right age for when the great Neil Adams hit.
Yeah.
Because he brought a hyper realism to comic book art. And for those of my generation, Neil Adams, along with Jim Steranko at Marvel, they were like the twin gods of comic book art in the late 60s. And they were like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones of comic books. And if somebody had told me, Michael, when I was that age, 12 years old in 1970, when I was looking at Neil Adams' Batman and drawing my own origin of Batman, and if somebody had told me, Arlen, one day when you get out of art school, you're going to go to New York City and you're going to pencil for Neil Adams and he's going to ink your pencils, wow, I would have had a 12-year-old heart attack right there. And yet, that's exactly what happened. I got out of art. I went to Rhode Island School of Design, which I only knew because the great Walt Simonson had burst on the scene in 1973 with the feature Manhunter, the backup in Detective Comics, Batman again.
Yeah.
And with a brand new style of drawing a superhero that Neil Adams had so dominated his realism, a whole generation of artists of that generation, the John Burns, the George Perez's, everybody that came after Neil Adams was influenced by him. His realism was the basically governing style of superhero comics in the early 70s. Walt Simonson comes along in 1973 with Manhunter and totally disregards the whole Neal Adams look. And if you look at those early Manhunters, that's why he became a star overnight. And I read in the letter columns, I was in high school at the time. I never heard of Rhode Island School of Design. I was either going to go to an art school or go to a university with a good art department.
Yeah.
And it said in the first letter column, in the fall of 73, when I was a sophomore, that he was a recent graduate of Rhode Island School of Design. And right there, like a comic book light bulb over my head appeared. If they could turn out an artist like Walt Simonson, because I was at those teenage years when I thought I was going to be a comic book artist. How naive, right? But when I got to RISD, which I ended up, going to, I learned about their graphic design department. I never even knew what graphic design was, but as I investigated in my freshman year, because I went thinking I was going to be an illustrator like Walt Simonson.
Yeah.
Right? But freshman year, I learned about graphic design, and RISD had considered one of the best graphic design, if not the best graphic design program in the country. Their illustration program was obviously great too, but when I learned that graphic design was images and text, words and pictures, I was like, well, that's what comics are. Comics are words and pictures. But graphic design seemed more attractive to me because it was more theoretical. It encompassed everything. Our entire world, Michael, is graphic design, words and pictures. The computer is words and pictures. Words and pictures go back to cuneiforms and hieroglyphics and the cave paintings, right? Yeah. Sequential images to tell a story. That I lecture about this stuff.
I used to do the same.
Yes, right. So I ended up, coming out of RISD. I worked in the Channel 13 art department, PBS, doing TV graphics. I ended up at NBC doing graphics for the David Letterman show. The first year his show was on the air. And then I ended up working for an ad agency as an art director. Anyway, but then when that job ended, I was 25 years old. I worked for big agencies and other things, but I was out of work, and I knew Neal Adams had a art studio called Continuity in Midtown, and I worked up the courage to go up there and drop off my sketchbook. And much to my surprise, the next day, I got a phone call saying, "Do you want to come up and work at the studio?" So I ended up working for my childhood idol. Now, that's awesome. I think for the first couple months, I had that tingling sensation just standing next to him that, oh my God, I'm working for Neal Adams, because I go back to that, childhood idea. And, but working for Neal Adams for 2 years was like going to graduate school, but getting paid for it. It was slave shop hours, and we were mostly doing advertising art, storyboards, animatics, comp art. These are all terms, but we weren't really doing comic book art because that's not where the money was. Neal had a family to support, and he was a great producer. But to be a freelance artist living in New York City, excuse me, like I was in the East Village in the mid '80s when I worked for Neal, and the money that we made, even though it was not a 40-hour week, it was more like a 60-hour week, but still it was great money for what we were doing. And those 2 years, my drawing improved 400%. And I knew that when I would be done working for Neal, I'd be ready to be on my own, because when you've worked for your childhood idol, who else can you work for? And basically, I've been a freelance artist ever since, and also as a writer, getting published. And I've been doing that and lecturing, and in post-pandemic developing webinars, and all these videos are on my YouTube and Vimeo channels and my website. Like my whole life is up there. But yeah, I've been both an illustrator, working in a comic book style, and trying to bring to commercial art really good comic book art previously comics and advertising were crappy, except for the stuff Neil was doing. But you see, when I left Neil, he was so busy doing advertising art and storyboards and animatics where the money was. Back then, comics were still paying like crap. So I figured, Neil was turning away a lot of comics for advertising because he was busy doing this other stuff. And I was like, gee, one guy could make a pretty good living just on the work he's turning down.
Yeah.
So I knew my art, my drawing could never compete with Neil Adams, but my graphic design sense, my sense of typography, the things that Neil wasn't a wunderkind on, I felt were my strengths. And that's what I've been trying to merge in my illustration work. Ironically, I went to RISD to be an illustrator. I majored in graphic design. I ended up making my living more as an illustrator, doing comics for advertising and editorial usage, developing superheroes for corporations and things like that. And then over time, if you love something, I don't know how you don't become a lover of its history.
Yeah.
Now, when Keith Richards plays a Rolling Stones lick, he knows the black bluesman that he took that from. Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese know the history of movies. Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan know the history of rock and roll and 20th century music. Great artists know the history of their medium. And I became a de facto comic book historian just by loving the art that influenced my own art, that influenced me to become an artist. And that resulted in that book. My love of the Twilight Zone, resulted in the only coffee table book about the show. It's out of print now, but this came out in 1990 from Chronicle Books.
Oh, wow.
And look, there's
the
embossed cover, the first influential image. And basically, my book is taking the dialogue and narration from certain episodes and images from other episodes. So it's like I call it a picture book for adults. But like this spread is made up of 2 images from 2 different episodes. And the dialogue and narration that I typeset to read like poetry is from 2 different episodes.
Okay.
And that's called Visions from the Twilight Zone. So I ended up feeding back the very images and influences and turned them into my own art in a way, even though it's a type of commercial art, doing coffee table books. So basically, I developed a twin history as a lecturer and educator. I've never actually taught, but I've lectured, ever since the late 80s to universities, conventions around the country. And I still do it. I do more webinars these days, but I would love to do more in the educational range. And I noticed that's what you do, Michael. And,
well, I spent 20 years actually as an educator. Now I work behind the scenes. I don't teach as often anymore. I work for, I don't advertise, but I work for an online art academy, and I'm the 2D faculty supervisor. So I work with the instructors now, and I use my education and some of my administrative knowledge now.
Well, listen, after this is over, I'd love to talk to you about that stuff. Because, there are things that maybe you can help me out with. That would be fabulous.
Yeah, but I used to talk about this. I taught a class that I helped develop, or that I did develop, and then throughout the years it changed with other instructors. But it was a visual storytelling class, and I would talk about all different types of storytelling. I worked professionally for 7 years in graphic design and developed and taught a graphic design.
Yeah, no, you've got this incredible background. I've been, looking at your website and all the stuff you've done, and I feel a certain kinship in the sense that, we both do these multiple things as both practitioners of the form. And I mean, if as a fan of my videos you are, all of those webinars, that's me teaching. Yeah. That's my teaching. But I should be teaching. Those are my forms of teaching.
Yeah. Which, by the way, I love what you call yourself. You are an edutainer, right? Is that the term
I
you
do
use?
edutainment. I say these aren't your father's art history lectures. I still go to lectures where there's a guy who has no good public speaking, mumbling into the microphone, showing one image at a time for 10 minutes. I've seen lectures at comic conventions that don't have visuals at all. And yet I dub what I do visual lectures with like one L, visual lectures. Because, the word lecture itself is a pejorative, like you're being lectured. But there's no other word to take its place. It is still a quote lecture, but the amount of time and design I put into my imagery, listen, I've seen everybody's presentations. I've got to believe nobody does what I do the way I do it, I think, as well as I do it. And my evidence is over 100 of these videos of these webinars and live lectures as well, are all on my YouTube and Vimeo channels, accessible through my website. So there it is. And like I said, all of those are like miniature classrooms because they're forms of me teaching. That's my teaching, curriculum vitae.
No, that's great. I mean, you've got an impressive resume, and let's kind of start moving on to the Twilight Zone book. I want to talk, but before we go on to that, Sillyville here. His name's David. He's got some Twilight Zone questions ready to go. His first one is: have you ever been on Twilight Zone ride at Disney, the Tower of Terror?
Yes, and I thought it sucked. It was basically a giant elevator that shook a little. Everything else was window dressing. I give it a total thumbs down.
Wow.
Sorry. Let me tell you something. Out of all of the post-Twilight Zone usages of the Twilight Zone, including the syndicated television series, including everything you think is the Twilight Zone, they all suck. There's only one Twilight Zone.
Well,
the original black and white, 1959 to 1964. They've tried to imitate it, knock it off, rip it off, starting with the Spielberg movie in '83, all of the remakes, including the most recent Jordan Peele thing. Did you see any of those that were on?
I haven't watched any of those.
Okay, guess what? They're not worth watching.
That's honestly why I didn't watch it.
All I will tell you is nothing compares. There is only one Twilight Zone. It's like the original Star Trek. Even though there have been a million other Star Treks since, there's still only one Star Trek, is there not?
Well, hold on. I may have to disagree there. I grew up. I was a Next Gen fan. That was my era.
Let me tell you something. How can I compare this to? Being a Next Gen fan is like being a fan of the John Buscema Conan and not knowing the Barry Smith Conan. It's like being a fan of the Murphy Anderson Hawkman and not knowing about the Joe Kubert Hawkman. It's a fan of the John Romita Sr. Spider-Man without knowing the Steve Ditko Spider-Man that preceded it.
Okay, I'm going to go with that. That's your opinion.
I made my point.
Yes.
Where were we?
No.
Where were we?
We were talking about the Twilight Zone ride in Disney World. And I will say this about it. I'm not one for free fall rides, but I have ridden it multiple times in my life. I'll never do it again because I don't like those type of rides. But
my point is, as a ride, it sucked too. It was basically an elevator that shook a little.
I don't know. Listen, I know a lot of people.
Wait. Am I not describing it accurately?
I mean, basically, but I mean, there are people who really, well, when you go up in the thing, it shakes a little. Then you have the drop, and then they added the randomized drop to it. I know a lot of people who love it, and I don't knock anyone.
What? There was not even a Twilight Zone episode that took place in an elevator. The whole listen, as a graphic designer, you learn about image and text. You learn about creating an experiential experience. There is nothing about the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror that has anything conceptually to do with the Twilight Zone. And you know what? Next time, can we talk about the Twilight Zone first before we take questions about the Twilight Zone? That make me have to go on a rant about something as ridiculous as the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror ride?
Oh, hold on. Listen.
Talk about my book.
We are going to talk about your book.
Twilight Zone later.
Twilight Zone.
Michael.
I just thought it would be a fun question to start with.
Michael.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that was a lot. I had a lot of fun. I'm glad it was fun for you.
Oh, I told you this was going to be an entertaining show for me.
What makes you think I'm entertained?
So we got here the 5 themes of the Twilight Zone, essays by Arlen Schumer. I have read every page that is bookmarked here. Okay, where's my camera? There it is. So you can see I got a bunch of.
There's a hardcover available.
Yeah, there's a hardcover available.
Signed at my website, signed hardcover.
And I went through all these here, and I gotta say, I really enjoyed the read. You know, one of the things I like about this is you kind of do a summary of every episode.
No.
Well, hold on.
Not every episode.
Well, no, not every episode, but what I'm reading, you know, some of it is a summary, but then you explain, you break off and talk about things that the directors have done, or how it relates to other episodes, or not even just episodes, relates to other things outside, possibly going on in the real world during that time. Absolutely. It was a very interesting piece for me. Because obviously I wasn't from the era, so some of the stuff I wasn't aware of. I didn't look up. Right. I mean, I had to look up to learn more.
And accomplished, though. You were my perfect audience.
Yeah,
you were a fan of the show before my book, but by organizing the book into these 5 themes, and then choosing what I thought, you know, there were 156 episodes. I'm very critical about the pop culture things that I love, whether it's comic book history, whether it's the music of Bruce Springsteen, my other major of scholarly focus, or in this case, the Twilight Zone. I think over half of the episodes were dogs, Michael. And yet I forgive them, because churning out weekly anthology television back in the day was very difficult, versus continuing characters like sitcoms and the same sets every week. With Twilight Zone, anthology, and there is no more anthology television on television, but doing anthology television meant every week you had different characters, different sets. You had to create a whole new world. And it was difficult on a tight budget. So I look at it more like baseball averages for hitters. If there were 156 episodes and I chose to write about 68 of them in my book, 68 out of 156, it's like batting 435. Not bad. Yeah. Sterling wrote 92 or 3 out of the 156 episodes. I think half of them were dogs. But out of the 68 episodes in my book, 41 of them were written by Sterling. And 41 out of 93, that's like batting 460 or something. So again, that's how I sort of grade the Twilight Zone. But those 68 episodes, Michael, those are the episodes that either affected me emotionally, affected me intellectually, philosophically, all the issues, all the great story themes of good and evil, man and the state, man and woman, life and death, are all in these Twilight Zone episodes in 25 minutes. The depth and breadth of the philosophical import of these episodes, and the terse storytelling style, you know, within 30 seconds, Serling and company would suck you into this, you know, reality shifting experience that you both identified with, because we've all sort of been there. You know, the great episode Mirror Image, where a woman sees a duplicate of herself at the bus station. Sterling wrote that and said it came from being in an airport in the lounge, and he saw somebody on the other side of the square that looked exactly like him. and he wrote that episode. Being locked in a department store at night, like the great episode, The After Hours, which is the mannequins that come to life episodes, right? I grew up in shopping malls in New Jersey, in Bergen County. They were the theme parks of my youth. And the idea I remember as a kid, as much as I love them, the thought of being alone in them at night would seem like a nightmare. And somehow Serling keyed into these like post-war American fears. I call it a psycho-American Gothic of sorts. You know, the idea of the atom bomb hanging over everybody's heads, which is what the post-war world was about, like a sword of Damocles.
Yeah.
You know, Serling put that into the Twilight Zone. You know, he was of the generation that came out of World War II psychologically scarred. You know, they didn't call it PTSD then. They called it shell shock. But he was part of the generation, like Norman Mailer, J.D. Salinger, that, you know, that generation, they kept the pain and the death they saw inside, most of them. But the creative ones were able to cathartically get it out through their art. And some became visual artists, some became writers, like the ones I mentioned. Serling is one of them.
Yeah.
And what he witnessed, you know, as a young man in his 20s, death so close. I mean, one of his best buddies was decapitated by a supply crate dropped from their own forces right in front of him.
Wow.
And he would have nightmares. He would wake up screaming. And that dark side of the human experience that was foisted upon a whole generation of young men in Serling ended up coming out in the Twilight Zone.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. Oh my God. I just want to say.
Anyway, so those episodes, the 68 episodes, I put into these 5 themes: science and superstition, suburban nightmares, a question of identity, obsolete man, and the time element. All the episodes that dealt with past and future and about time. And the way I want readers to take these essays, you described it perfectly. Each episode has like tributaries into so many things that I grew up with, and that as an adult and as a scholar and as a pop culture historian are part of what made the Twilight Zone great, is how it was both of its time, but it was also timeless. Serling was a visionary. There's an episode called Midnight Sun about the Earth moving closer to the sun. I mean, it's global warming by like an Old Testament Jewish prophet is what Serling was. It was what Bob Dylan was, you know, in light of this recent movie about him. Both of these men were Jewish men of the 20th century that were like old Jewish prophets from the Old Testament, being visionary about what our society was and what it could be. You know, Dylan came to the fore with Blowing in the Wind, right? It was a hopeful song about what if. Well, the Twilight Zone was Serling presenting our society as a what if. What if there wasn't bigotry? What if there wasn't racism? These were issues we're still dealing with today, but Serling did them in the Twilight Zone. You know, I did a webinar during the pandemic shutdown, Michael, called Twilight Zone in the Age of Corona, because so many of the greatest episodes, most of which I write about in my book, are about the very same issues of isolation, loneliness, deserted cities, all the things we were going through, being sheltered in place during the pandemic, were in these Twilight Zone episodes. And that's what makes Serling, not only should he be considered one of the greatest American television writers of the 20th century, but I maintain he should be considered just one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century, which is all how he wanted to be remembered, was as a writer. And when you think about how the Twilight Zone's influence, which I talk about in my lectures, it was not only influenced by the surrealism that preceded it, but it ended up influencing so much of television, films, modern art, popular culture
Absolutely, yeah.
that came after it. You know, that spinning vortex of the Twilight Zone's 1961 opening. That was a year before op art burst upon the scene with black and white concentric circle imagery. You know, the time tunnel, Irwin Allen, 1966. Where do you think that idea came from? That's just, you know, the iceberg of the Twilight Zone's influence. There would be no Star Trek without the Twilight Zone. Roddenberry delivered the eulogy at Serling's funeral in 75 when he died at the age of 50 from all those cigarettes he smoked.
Yeah.
And he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, that without Serling's and the Twilight Zone, Star Trek would have been a glimmer in his eye. You talk about the diversity casting of Star Trek. Well, who do you think Roddenberry was influenced by? Serling and the Twilight Zone cast in 1960 the first black man in a dramatic role on television when there were no black people on television at all.
Yeah.
You know, he cast women in dramatic roles as independent single women, not like Lucille Ball Housewives or Donna Reed, you know, those kind of roles. Serling himself had 2 daughters, and maybe that's why. But in these Twilight Zone episodes, many of the greatest episodes are about single women. The Midnight Sun that I mentioned is about a single woman artist living in New York City. You think in 1961 there were other television shows about single women artists living alone in New York City? No. But Serling wrote it.
Wow. Yeah, no, he was definitely one of those people ahead of his time with the way he told stories. And you know, I didn't know a lot about his history. You know, I knew he was in World War II. I knew I didn't realize, you know, that he had the nightmares and shell shock and things like that. It makes sense, but I didn't realize that.
Well, there's a great graphic novel that came out a few years ago by fellow Brooklynite Corin Shadme called Twilight Man, and it mostly focuses on his war years and what he witnessed. So if you're interested in that particular aspect of Serling,
get
that graphic novel, Twilight Man by Corin Shadme.
Twilight Man. Excuse me. Yeah, no, I'm gonna have to check that one out. But yeah, it does make sense. And you know, I know things were always you know, the stuff I grew up on later on in life. I see the influence after I watched episodes. I wanted to ask you about a couple of episodes here. And let's do, I'm just looking. Well, let's start with my favorite episode, The Howling Man.
Why is that your favorite?
I don't know. You know, I've always, you know, I think maybe it's me as an artist or what I grew up on. I like the idea of, you know, someone trying to contain and stop evil, and evil can never be contained. You know, it's always escaping. There's always going to be evil, and there's always going to be good men trying to prevent it. You know, and to me, that's superheroes. You know, which is what I grew up on. It's Superman. It's whoever you want to name as a hero. It's that type of stuff.
A lot of Twilight Zone fans love that episode. I mean, it doesn't rank #1 in any of the polls I've seen, but it is, I think in my essay, I call it one of the best loved, don't I? If you read my essay on it, I call it one of the best loved Twilight Zone episodes, and I give the reasons why.
You know, someone is saying there's a little echo. I don't know if that's on my end. Let me see something. I'm just going to check my audio real quick.
Because I don't hear it coming from my end.
You know what I'm going to do? Give me 1 second. I'm just going to switch over to headphones. Maybe that'll fix it.
It sounds like bubbles from being underwater. I hear a bubbling sound.
Okay, let's try this here.
You hear that?
Okay, I hear you now. Do you hear the echoing?
Well, I'm still hearing this like gurgling, bubbling sound.
Let me see.
Do you not hear that?
No, hold on. I have a fan on. Maybe that was it.
Oh, gee, that was it.
I'm sorry. Usually that doesn't get picked up that way.
Michael, 5 more demerits.
I do have to put a fan on though because I can't breathe in this room.
Yeah, but you can't put a fan next to a microphone.
It never picks it up. No, but the echoing is still there.
Just my fortune, just my show. It picks it up. My luck.
Let me see.
How memorable.
Let me see. Okay.
Well, thank me for helping you solve that problem.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. If you still hear the echo, I apologize.
No, it's
definitely not the fan.
It's the fan.
Well, it's definitely not the new fan I put on. Ray is saying it's feedback.
Yeah, it was from the fan. The minute you turned it off, it stopped. Can we spend less time on the fan?
Okay, let's move on a little bit here. I'm just going to go to some comments here. Let's see. Ray says, just going back to Rod Serling, Kirby also suffered from shell shock.
I mentioned him in my introduction. I add him to the list. Harvey Kurtz, that whole generation came out of the war, and put it into their creative work. Those that could. But, most men, they say they never talked about the war. They had no cathartic outlet to put these experiences into. So that's why they say most of that generation, they never talked about it. Yeah, because they weren't artistic. They weren't trained or shown that you could get these feelings out. Anyway, I digress.
So the reason I want to say I love The Howling Man is one of the few episodes that truly scared me. And that was at the end as the devil starts appearing.
Did you read my essay about The Howling Man?
Yes, I did. I read that.
And you have anything to say about it?
Well, I have to go back. Give me a second. I read it last week.
And I'm only saying this because there's something very specific about that episode that I think is worth discussing.
Let me go back and just take a quick skim because it's been a while.
Only because you brought this episode up out of all the 156 episodes. Okay.
All right. How about you?
I'll give you a hint. Go to the very end.
Yeah. Are you talking about the postscript?
Right before that. What's the paragraph right before?
The ancient folk saying.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll read the ancient folk saying here. You can catch the devil, but you can't hold him long.
No. You're reading the postscript.
No, that's the one.
Hold on. Let me get to it since you brought the episode up.
I'm just.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. You were right.
Yeah.
Read the postscript.
Okay. The meta-irony of the ending is that in 1960, the devil Satan was indeed released, resulting in, to paraphrase Brother Jerome, the evil that soon took on the shape of the Vietnam War, the assassination of the Kennedys, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. So, Yeah, no. I find that, very, kind of almost like he was seeing the future in what he was doing.
And keep in mind, it's not Serling. Charles Beaumont wrote that episode.
Oh, Charles. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I'm sure I was. But
Favorite episode, and you don't know Charles Beaumont wrote it?
I apologize, but I don't remember names well.
5 more demerits.
5
more demerits. Michael, you called it your favorite episode.
Yes, but I don't.
And you don't even know who wrote it.
I don't always go by people's names. I learned that in comics. I don't learn that all the time in TV.
Why?
The only
thing you love, you're not interested in who created it?
Yes and no. I mean, I will say, I love the Twilight Zone, but I was always a cartoon guy. So I know for a fact that any cartoon I watched growing up written by Michael Reeves was going to be my favorite cartoon of that series.
Michael Reeves that wrote for the Batman animated series?
He did write a little bit for the Batman the animated series. He wrote for
about the Batman animated series.
He also wrote for the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. He wrote for he wrote for tons, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, everything that
yeah, he was your man.
I did so, but I didn't realize it until the 90s. And I was getting on the internet and I was looking up old cartoons, and I saw all my favorite episodes were by this guy, Michael Reeves, who I then, was like, oh, I got to learn more. But
That's how it works.
I wasn't into that with a lot of television and movies. My stuff was always comics and animation. So even though I love the show and I love the story, for me, when I would talk about these and lecture in class about episodes, it was more about the story and the themes and meanings behind the storytelling, or the way the storytelling was done, as opposed to that.
Part of the story is knowing who the author of the story is. Nice rationalization. I ain't buying it.
Okay. All right.
I ain't buying it. Anyway.
So
Howling Man is your favorite episode. Okay.
I would think it's up there, definitely in the top 3.
It's barely in my top 50, the Howling.
But it's the first one in the
I'm telling you, listen, you're not alone. Part of the reason why I chose to only write about the episodes I felt were worthy writing about, again, for the criteria, either they emotionally affected me or intellectually. And basically, all critics and historians start out as fans of whatever they end up being critics or historians about.
Yeah.
And I think that is also, having a critical eye. But, what was I lost my train of thought there. In choosing those 68 episodes, I purposely am throwing down the gauntlet by saying that part of the problem with the internet, it's so democratic that my worst episode is somebody's favorite and somebody else's favorite is my worst episode. Mm-hmm. There never seems to be a clear consensus of what are the, quote, best. They can't all be equally good, even though every episode has a website devoted to it practically. I'm exaggerating, of course. But my point is, in every other art form, Michael, movies, music, literature, critics and historians get together and they make consensuses. In the fine art world, there is a consensus of who the greatest living artists are. Now, just because you either like them or don't like them doesn't mean that, in a sense, you're qualified to call them, quote, art or not. The AFI, American Film Institute, they come out with those, polls every couple of years, the greatest movies of all time. That's what critics and historians do. Nobody's done that for the Twilight Zone. Previous books about the show, and I've got them all on my shelf, they write about all 156 episodes. Most episode guides of television shows Well, it's about every episode. I purposely am throwing down the gauntlet and saying, you know what? They weren't all equally great, even though they all have their fans. But I'm choosing to say these episodes, these 68, are worthy of being called art. That if the aliens beamed down and said we have room on our spaceship for one Earth television show, they don't have room for all 156 episodes, but I'm giving them my 68 episodes along with a hardcover copy of my book. And, you know, I would advise the aliens to do with the book what I'm advising everybody to do with my book. Whether you're a newbie to the Twilight Zone or an aficionado, watch the episodes in the order I put them in my book by these themes. Watch them first with your significant other. They're for men and women. These episodes are about everything, and your significant other will enjoy them. Watch the episode first. Form your own opinions about them. Then read my essay. If I've done my job, Michael, I will bring up these tributaries of connotations to things in the art world, things in history, things in the culture, sociological, visionary. I let every episode, which I've seen 1,000 times, of course, proverbially, but maybe literally, and I watched them fresh and I took notes, as my 8th grade science teacher would say, copious notes. And I allowed a free association of whatever might occur to me. You know, I treated the images like art photography in my first book, and I compared them to the great black and white images of all time, really, and how they had a surrealistic look. Yeah. So I've always thought the Twilight Zone was this very visual show as well. But yeah, I mean, again, where was I going with this? I go off on so many tributaries. My original train of thought, Michael, you're supposed to be reminding me where I am, like a script girl in movies. Where was I? Okay, so anyway, what I'm saying is, I guess I'm back to saying, so these 68 episodes, I feel, are the Twilight Zone's greatest hits. And for all the aficionados and the fans that might say, Arlen, but what about this episode? And what about this episode? You know what my answer to them is? Write your own essays. Publish your own book. And you know what? That's what art critics and historians do.
Yeah.
So, by the way, now I know where I was. So if I've done my job with each episode essay, I might make everybody from the aficionado who's seen these episodes like I have, I might make them think about something, reminisce about something, feel something, learn something about these episodes that they might not have known or learned before. And that's for the aficionado. For the newbie, are you kidding? Each episode, like the excerpt of The Howling you just read, I bet you for every fan of The Howling, and there are many, just reading that postscript where I compare it to this idea that when Beaumont was writing that in 1960, in a sense, at the end, when she lets the devil out of the closet, right? Mm-hmm. The maid that he's telling the story to?
Yes.
Well, at the end of the episode, she lets the devil out. She lets the door open. Well, what happened in 1960 in real life in America? You might say the devil was let out. And in the same way the episode talked about when they had the devil in prison, it was between the two world wars. That's why there was peace in the world, because they had the devil in prison. But before that, World War I was when the devil was let out. And then when the devil was let out again, World War II happened. This is according to Beaumont's story. So what happened in 1960 to America when she let the devil out? There was plenty of great stuff in the 60s, but the devil was let loose, right? In the form of the assassinations, the Vietnam War, the very words Jerome spoke had their parallels in the 60s. And that makes you think about the Howling Man, hopefully, in a way, even the diehard aficionado of that show might not have never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
Including you.
Yeah. No.
The guy who said it was your favorite episode.
Yeah, it is. It's like I said, one of the
top have I made you think about it in a way you might not have thought about it?
Well, I wasn't around in those times, so
I wasn't around either, by the way. I was a baby.
I understand, but what I'm saying is, for me, I wasn't thinking about what was going on in the era, so I'd have to go back in and think about it, you know.
But some are of their time, some are timeless, some are visionary.
Yeah.
It's truly, that's the greatness of the anthology concept, is that Serling and company, Richard Matheson, who wrote the second amount of Twilight Zone episodes after Serling, famous science fiction writer. So between him and Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson, famed science fiction writer, he wrote the first episode of Star Trek. Yeah. He wrote some key Twilight Zone episodes, and they're all in my book. You know, I think there's 8 Matheson episodes and 7 Beaumont episodes. But again, you know, I'm sure there are episodes that fans of the Twilight Zone are not in there, but that's and by fitting them into these themes, I think I've made a good case for why these are the Twilight Zone's greatest hits.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, listen, I like I said, I read everything that I have marked here. Well,
what else? Other than Howling Man.
Okay, well, I feel like I'm going to get beat up again verbally.
Oh, have I really hurt you that?
No. I'm kidding.
Where's your thick skin?
I'm kidding with you. Believe me, I have a very.
Many a truth is said in jest.
No. It's.
Oh, Michael, come on.
Believe me.
I thought you would take it.
Nothing
You're
bothers.
from Brooklyn.
Well, I'm not from it, but.
Where are you from?
I grew up in a town called Mayapack, New York. It's about an hour and a half north of Brooklyn, but I would go visit my family in Brooklyn.
Okay, close enough.
Quite often. Anyway, the next one I'll say that is in my top 3 is the obsolete man.
Ah, one of the themes itself.
Yes, one of the themes itself. Now, the reason for me is I think at some point, everyone kind of questions their faith. Also, I think, and especially, you know, I think right now with what's going on in the world where it feels like faith isn't a big part of people's lives anymore.
Well, hold on a second. How does obsolete man make you question your faith?
Well, I don't think it makes me. I think everyone has questioned the faith. When you read when you look at the obsolete man, you know, it's.
Well, how is it about a man questioning his faith?
He's not questioning his faith. He believes in God and he has it strong. The rest of the world doesn't. And then when he's locked in the room,
the state.
Yes, sorry, the state. When the rest, when what's his name there? I'm bad with names. Is locked in the room with him and he makes him question. You know what I mean? Like, and then at the end, he's like praying to God, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." Like, it's a very interesting.
Serling mentions God, and I point this out in my essays in the book. He mentions God a lot in the Twilight Zone, I always point it out where he mentions it. You know, in Obsolete Man, he's got Burgess Meredith actually reciting Psalm 23, I think, out loud. You know, the Lord is my shepherd, and where else on television in 1961 would you get a man reciting from out of the Old Testament on television in a dramatic context?
Yeah.
I mean, again, it was ahead of its time and it's timeless. That's what makes that episode and the theme itself, Obsolete Man. You know, we all question not necessarily our faith, Michael. It's also about questioning our individual worth in society. You know, are we obsolete? You know, with the threat of AI and robotics and all this happening in our culture now,
Yeah.
You know, this is what happens when there's technological advance. Men become obsolete. It happened during the Industrial Revolution, and it's happening with robotics and AI. As an artist, and you feel this too, AI is churning out art that to the layman's eye looks like original art.
Mm-hmm.
And art directors and creative directors, you think they're going to care that they're putting real artists out of business?
No.
They need to save money on budgets. Hey, look, boss, look at what I did for this latest ad. How much did it cost? You're not going to believe it compared to hiring a human being. So I have to ask, as an illustrator, you know, am I obsolete? I think I am.
Well,
you
listen,
know,
I'll be honest. I worked on a book in the last year, and when it came out, and I was seeing all this artwork, like, you know, in advertising the book, and I'm like, crap, I wish I did a stronger pieces for this book. I feel like my stuff might be the weakest. I found out they did a lot of AI in the book afterwards.
See,
and I'm very.
We let the enemy, and it is us. This is the problem. The greatest meme that I've seen about the whole AI thing on Facebook was somebody saying, you know, I expected AI to do all the kind of chores and robotic work so that I could be free to make art and write poetry. I didn't think AI would be writing the poetry and the art so I could do all the menial tasks of life.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening.
That
AI is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is doing our fucking laundry. So I could be creative.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, I know people who use AI professionally. It's not their final output, but they use it.
Like any piece of art, it's a tool.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what people
how you use
realize.
But the average usage of it is going to be a ripoff.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. And there's no stopping technology. So, like I said, the degree with which we allow it to take over our creative side of our lives is detrimental, because it can't come up with original ideas. It's the classic science fiction cliche of at least 3 Star Trek episodes, you know, with Nomad, you know, and it's always about, you know, you can't come up with an original thought. And that separates man from machine. It doesn't have a soul.
Yeah.
It doesn't have, quote, God or faith or those supernatural things that exist between science and superstition.
Yeah. Yeah. No. As you've been talking, I've been looking through the book for which I want to pick as a third to talk about here. The only thing I will say, we don't need to talk about this episode, but The Shelter. I love that episode, but
we don't need to talk about it. Why are you bringing it up?
I'll say why. Because it's one of my favorite parodies on The Simpsons. Did you ever see the episode of The Simpsons where The Shelter? I don't know.
It doesn't come to mind.
Oh,
maybe I've seen it and not realize. They've done a bunch of Twilight Zone homages, I know, but maybe I haven't seen that one in particular.
It's has a shelter, and
great episode.
Yeah.
And its sister episode is The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street.
Let me tell you, first of all, I've always loved that episode.
Which one?
Monsters Are Due on Maple Street.
One of the most favorite.
When I was in 7th grade, before I saw that, my teacher made us, my English teacher made us read the story first, read the actual short story.
Written by Serling, as a short story?
As a short story. And then
I've never read that, so I can't vouch for it. I mean, does it work as a short story? I don't know.
I don't remember. I was in 7th grade, but all I knew was I was excited because he was bringing in the Twilight Zone episode to watch afterwards. And so that's one of the...
Having read the story first before you saw the episode? Is that it?
Well, that was the idea, but I grew up watching the Twilight
Had you seen it before you read it?
I saw it before I read it, yeah.
No, what would be interesting is if that was your first exposure, the story, and then does the episode live up to the story?
Yeah. I don't know, I'm gonna have to. I'd have to remember. But I know for a lot of the kids in the class, it was the first time they were seeing it.
And did they love it? Did they like it?
A lot of people they enjoyed definitely the episode. I know that. I don't remember about the short story.
No, I mean, did they like the episode?
Yeah, no, they a lot of the kids liked it. I feel like it was when I was teaching my storytelling class and I would do comedy. I would teach my students about like Abbott and Costello and Laurel and Hardy, and they had no clue. A lot of them. I would have like one student that maybe knew.
Yeah.
And they ended up loving those
of
guys.
Of course, when they were exposed to it.
Yeah.
You know, I grew up with the Little Rascals.
Yeah.
The Little Rascals taught a whole baby boom generation, and I'm on the tail end of the baby boom. Yeah. You know, there were black kids in the Little Rascals. They all loved each other. They all worked together. It taught a whole generation of white kids watching it on television to think about we're all equal, we're all the same. And this is why my generation got behind the civil rights movement. I was a white Jewish kid in New Jersey. I didn't know any black people, but I learned about black people through the Twilight Zone, through the comic books that featured black people in the backgrounds before television and movies did, and things like that. So, you know, and it was the Serlings, it was the Jack Kirbys, it was the Neil Adams, it was these comic book artists that brought the real world into their art form.
Yeah.
And so did Roddenberry and the best science fiction. That's what it does. It brings the concerns of the real world into the past or the future, and it's called science fiction. But it's basically always reflecting reality. Writers cannot not write about reality. You could call it fantasy all you want, but they're writing from the reality. Where do you think Lord of the Rings came from?
Yeah.
It came from his experiences in World War II, right? And I've never read Lord of the Rings. But from what I know, that wouldn't have happened without World War II, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. The Shire was his home in England. And yeah,
so my point is, call it fantasy illusion. You're always writing, whether you're consciously, subconsciously, or unconsciously. You cannot not reflect your reality. Exactly. And my reality is different from your reality, and that's what makes us all individual snowflakes. But with artists, when you plumb the uniqueness of your own reality and put it into your art and put it out there, like Serling and company did with these Twilight Zone episodes, it ends up becoming universal.
Yeah.
That's the secret sauce of, quote, art or anything original.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I do want to get to, you sent me a video earlier today, and I watched the majority of it because I didn't, my day.
I'm sorry I didn't send it to you sooner. I screwed up.
It's okay. My day gig is I'm in my busy season right now. I have like the next like 2-3 weeks.
God bless you that you have a day gig.
And so I didn't see the email until 7 p.m.
I know.
And so
I
like,
sent it at 7.
Yeah, I have like 15. I have like 15 minutes left of that video to watch. That I want to get to that, but before we do, is there anybody in the audience who has questions about the Twilight Zone or anything that we've talked about so far? There is one question, and I don't know if you would know the answer, but Dave really recently watched the entire series on Netflix with his daughter, but they didn't have the Burgess Meredith episode. Would you know why it wasn't included?
First of all, that's one of the most famous episodes.
Yeah.
Is there a chance that maybe, the fault was with you somehow, that you missed it? Because there is no logical reason why one of the most famous episodes, well loved, is not on Netflix. So I don't know what happened there, but that episode is so loved, but I think for the wrong reasons, or not necessarily the wrong reasons, but it's all about Burgess Meredith. We fall in love with the guy. He has a horrible wife. He's the only survivor of, the bomb that destroys the world. And at the end, he finally gets to do what he always wanted, was just to read his books. And he's on the library steps. And what happens? He trips and he breaks his glasses. So a character we've been made to fall in love with gets hit by cruel fate, nothing he deserved or did. It so violates the rules of storytelling that are implicit between a writer and his audience. You can't manipulate us by making us love a character and then harm him in such a way that we remember that episode because of the cruelty of that ending. But here's the irony. While Serling wrote that episode, it's an adaptation of a short story by one Lynn Venable, which I assume is a woman. I believe that is not a Serling worldview, meaning if it were a Serling original, I believe it would have ended with Meredith on the steps reading his books and a slow crane shot pull away. That would have been Serling's worldview. But people remember it for the cruelty, which was not, I believe, the way Serling would have handled it. But Serling was a master adapter of great short stories like Time Enough at Last. And there's an art to adaptation, especially a short story to a 25-minute television show, which had never really been done before. Science fiction in the 50s was all the giant ants and the stupid, silly movies. Yeah, there were a few gems, Forbidden Planet, it came from outer space, War of the Worlds. Those are the three biggies. But by and large, Hollywood didn't take serious science fiction literature. It was considered junk literature. It was a cult. It was created by a bunch of writers in Southern California. And Serling, while not a science fiction writer, loved science fiction. And when he got the chance to do the Twilight Zone, he met with Ray Bradbury and said, "Can you recommend some great writers that I can use?" And Bradbury turned him on to Matheson and Beaumont. But the thing is, Serling was a master at adapting their serious science fiction stories to this relatively new medium of film television. In the 50s, great television was live in New York. That's where Serling made his bones. He won 3 Emmys in a row in the mid-50s that gave him the creative clout to go out to Hollywood to do the Twilight Zone. Just as live television was shutting down and moving to film television, modern television as we know it. So it was a relatively new medium in 1959 when Serling debuts the Twilight Zone. Serious science fiction literature treated seriously as 25-minute television shows. So while Serling didn't invent stories about female robots, let's say, or any of the science fiction concepts that are in the Twilight Zone episodes from the short stories that he and the other writers adapted, but he brought them to television. And that is what made the Twilight Zone so great and so memorable and so influential. When Stephen King wrote his nonfiction overview called Dance Macabre in 1983 about the science fiction, fantasy, and horror fields, he had a whole chapter about the Twilight Zone. And he basically said, Serling and the Twilight Zone, and I'm paraphrasing, lit the sparks of our creative imagination, me and my whole generation, to a world of unlimited possibilities. Well, Stephen King, Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, David Lynch, all the creators of our modern fantasy and science fiction and their descendants, the J.J. Abrams, the Chris Carters, the Vince Sullivans, everybody that creates our modern fantasy, science fiction, or horror culture, I can trace back to Serling in less than 6 degrees of Serling. I'm punning on Kevin Bacon, but that is why I call Serling in the Twilight Zone the father of American popular culture. is because without the Twilight Zone, we may not have gotten Star Wars or Jaws or Close Encounters or all of, you name it. You name it. And that's what I do in my book. I start out in my preface by calling it the father of American popular culture. And the last sentence in my book restates it. And what I'm basically saying, Michael, is all the essays in between are me making the case. Is Serling in the Twilight Zone the father of American popular culture? You be the judge.
Yeah.
But yeah, I recommend people watch the episodes in order of the book. They stream on Paramount Plus, on this Pluto TV, or buy the DVDs. The Blu-ray transfers are incredible. They look like they were filmed yesterday in the East Village somewhere. But yeah, and then after you watch the episodes, read my essays. They may get you to watch the episode again to see all the connections that I make that you might not have realized about your favorite episodes.
No, it's a good way to look at it. I mean, I'm going to go back and watch them. I didn't think of watching them in the way.
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying that's how I recommend.
But
it's like a viewer's guide to watching or rewatching the Twilight Zone.
Yeah. No, it's a good idea. I just want to again touch upon the video you sent me, where you talk about Serling being influenced by Serling. I'm sorry. I used to say Sterling as a kid.
More demerits.
Serling. I don't know why I did that.
First of all, tell people the video. It's called Comic Books and the Twilight Zone.
Yes. All right. I was going to pull up the title. It's in my email. But yeah, Comic Books and the Twilight, and it's on your
Vimeo
channel. Vimeo, yeah. Comic Books in the Twilight Zone, and Arlen has a good hour edutainment time of talking about the comics that that Serling read during his time in the military.
Maybe,
you know, and possibly afterwards or even before. We don't know, you know, where his love of comics started, but some of the,
we can only assume.
Yeah, the visuals that you show of certain books appear to be almost identical to scenes from other episodes of the Twilight Zone. And I think that's fascinating, number one. Number two, do you know if there was any issues with the comic companies where, you know, saying, no, these are our stories? Or
EC Comics in the early 50s were adapting Ray Bradbury stories without paying him.
Okay.
He eventually reached out, contacted them, and they ended up with some agreement, and they ended up putting his name, you know, on the covers, you know. So, yeah, but no, with Twilight Zone, it's different because, you know, nobody's made this connection before I did that.
Yeah.
Its most famous episode, Eye of the Beholder, the one with the pig faces.
Yeah.
Which used to top all the polls as greatest Twilight Zone episode. Now it's usually Time Enough at Last or To Serve Man, but it used to always be Eye of the Beholder, because once you've seen those pig faces at whatever age you come across that, you never forget them. There's never been anything like them. They're both sort of funny in a way, but they're also grotesque. And riding that line between comedy and tragedy, or comedy and horror, is a very difficult creative line to tightrope walk. And yet Serling in the Twilight Zone rode that line perfectly with those pig faces. But yeah, so in that episode, what were we talking about?
We're talking about Serling and the comics and
so it's about, you know, all during the episode, a woman is getting plastic surgery because she's supposed to be hideously ugly. But all during the episode, of course, we never see the doctors or nurses' faces. They're either shot from behind, they're in the shadows. We know something's up, but we don't know what. But when we get to the end of the episode, spoiler alert, she turns out to be beautiful. She's She's Donna Douglas, who would later be Ellie Mae Clampett on the Beverly Hillbillies. But she's kind of like a poor man's Marilyn Monroe. But she's a beautiful blonde. And then we see the doctors and nurses, and they're ugly. So, you know, that episode, which, like I said, used to top all the polls. Gee, what was my train of thought again? I got caught up. Why
I was saying how comics were, or he was.
Comics. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So that episode, there is an EC science fiction episode story, an 8-pager from like 1953. It's called The Ugly One. And just by the title alone, to make a long story short, it's basically the same story where the people you think are beautiful are ugly and vice versa. Now, 7 years separates I, the Beholder from that story. Written by the usual Bill Gaines and Al Feldstein, if you know your EC science fiction comics of the early 50s. I assume Serling, as a serviceman, like they all did, read comics. And he loved science fiction. I guarantee you, if I were a betting man, that Serling read the EC horror and science fiction comics because he was a fan of those genres. And he claims that I, the Beholder, came to him while he was awake one night in the dark. Remember, he had recurring nightmares from his PTSD. Well, my theory is that he had a sense memory when he created I, the Beholder, from this EC science fiction story, because it's basically the same theme, basically the same plot almost. Not really, but it's the same theme. And I show that in this lecture. And there are other episodes that are also both influenced the Twilight Zone, but also that the Twilight Zone influenced comics, especially the early Marvel comics when they were pre-superhero. Mm-hmm. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, the guys that would do Spider-Man later, would do these little 5-page science fiction-y horror stories with surprise endings. And they were written and produced in 1960, 61, 62, a couple of years after the Twilight Zone debuted. And there are episodes about mannequins coming to life, about the last man on Earth, episodes that are similar to these Twilight Zone episodes. And one of them was written by Lee and drawn by Ditko. And I think Lee only wrote the dialogue. That's a whole other story. But it was about a teenager who gets superpowers. And instead of using them to fight crime, uses them selfishly to make money. And what happens? He loses the father figure in his life to a criminal that he could have saved if he hadn't been counting his money. Now, you know the story I'm describing.
Absolutely.
But that is a Twilight Zone superhero story. It's built on the same irony and surprise endings that Serling perfected. He didn't create the surprise ending. O. Henry did it in literature. Alfred Hitchcock did it. But again, just like his great adaptations, Serling perfected the surprise ending. Nobody sits around and talks about the surprise endings of Alfred Hitchcock, but they do talk about the incredible surprise endings of the Twilight Zone.
Yeah. Wow.
You like all these tangents I go on that
listen, I actually love it.
Remember my original point.
Yeah, and I forget it sometimes too. I'm lucky I'm following. But let me ask you a question.
Yes.
All these links that you've sent me, they can get on your website, arlenschumer.com.
Yes.
Okay.
Because there's subpages for Silver Age, for the Twilight Zone. You could order my book, and I'll give you a signed hardcover of both. They're at a discounted price. So, yeah, and I guarantee you both books are definitive for their genres. There's no other comic book history. And I've got every comic book history book on my shelves. just like I have every other book about the Twilight Zone. But I believe both of my books are definitive for their subject matter. And I challenge everybody to get a copy, read them. And if you don't agree, let me know.
All right.
I stand by my work, though.
Now, there is one link I'm going to share because obviously they can go to, arlenschumer.com and get everything, and they can get this on there. But I want them to have this link right now, and that is a link to your upcoming signing. Can you tell us about that?
I'm doing a combination screening and book signing at a great cabaret theater on the Upper West Side in New York City called the Triad on Thursday night, January 30th. And again, on my website, there's an events blog page, and you'll see the event with all the URL links you'll need to buy tickets. But it's a double screening of Serling's favorite episode, which is called The Stop at Willoughby, which is another fan favorite episode. And I match it with an incredible cult film from the 60s that Burt Lancaster considered his greatest performance. And it was this incredible film called The Swimmer. Michael, have you ever heard of it or seen it?
No, I don't think I know I haven't seen it. I don't think I've heard of it either.
Well, you've heard of Burt Lancaster.
Absolutely.
Okay. He considered The Swimmer his greatest performance and the greatest film he was ever in. But like all cult films, it bombed in its original 1968 release. To make a long story short, The Swimmer is based on the greatest short story by one of America's greatest short story chroniclers of the dark underbelly of suburbia, the great John Cheever, who published The Swimmer as a short story in an issue of The New Yorker in 1964. Lancaster had it made into a movie 4 years later. The Swimmer is about a middle-aged guy who literally swims across his neighborhood through his neighbor's swimming pools in order to reach home. Now, if that concept alone does not say cue the Twilight Zone music, it's basically a Twilight Zone episode as a feature film. In fact, Grindhouse Video released a Blu-ray version of it that I recommend you get. That the copy on the back of the box set says it's like a feature-length Twilight Zone episode by way of The New Yorker. And that is a perfect description. And if that description is accurate, what episode does it most resemble? A Stop at Willoughby. And in my presentation at the Triad, I will first introduce the Willoughby episode. Then I will bridge that to the Cheever short story, which came out 4 years after the Twilight Zone episode. But I present a case that Cheever was influenced by that Twilight Zone episode to write The Swimmer, which then becomes this incredible film. And that if you've never seen it, the Triad has a brand new 4K deluxe screen with a surround sound. We'll be projecting the Blu-rays of both. And then I'll be doing a book signing after the screening. So that'll be at 8 o'clock Thursday night, the 30th. And if you're in the New York metropolitan area, it's worth the schlep in to come see me and see this incredible double bill that will make you think differently about that Willoughby episode. And if you've never seen The Swimmer, do a little research on it. There's plenty of YouTube videos that review the episode and talk about it. And I'm telling you, you've never seen anything like it. It's at times it's almost like a pre-psychedelic film, but the themes it touches upon are so much of what the 1960s were about in terms of the counterculture versus the establishment, rejecting the themes of the establishment culture of the 60s. It's almost like an East Coast version of The Graduate.
Okay.
The same way The Graduate was about the Los Angeles go-go lifestyle and how it reflected the clash between the alcohol drinking parents' generation and the new youth. Well, those are themes that Serling, the visionary, was talking about, believe it or not, in 1960, when the character in Willoughby says to his materialist wife, some people aren't built for competition, or rich communities they don't feel comfortable in, or country clubs they wear around their neck like a badge of status. That is Serling in 1960, writing about the very themes that years later the counterculture would be accusing the establishment of. And that's what Cheever was writing about, and that's what the movie was about, but that's what Serling was about too. And I weave them all together in what I promise you will be an unforgettable night of theater. And buying a ticket gets you a copy of my book as well. So go to my website, go to the Triad Theater website. All the information's up there.
Yes, or click the link I just put in all the comments.
Beautiful.
Into the comments there, or like you said, arlenschumer.com. I think we're gonna wrap it up. I have other questions for you, not of Twilight Zone, but of like superheroes and other things. And
I tell you, we would only get to the tip of the iceberg.
I know. And I would love to talk to you about Batman. I know the Adam West series just celebrated an anniversary.
On that,
but let's save that for.
Well, Michael, I haven't scared you off.
Not at all. Not at all.
I hope not. Jeez.
No, not at all, man. I would love to talk more. You're
like the younger brother I always wanted and never got.
Thank you. I think my brother might trade you. So
hey, screw him.
I have an older brother.
So do I.
So, but yeah, no. Let's.
Listen, Michael. Listen, anytime you want to have me on,
yeah.
Let me know, because now we're bonded.
Yes, I had a lot of fun tonight.
Not as much as I did.
I'm sure you.
Listen, I'm from New Jersey, and I love busting balls. So you got to be prepared to have your balls busted.
It's okay. Listen,
you can try busting my balls, but they're dipped in bronze. Good luck.
Listen, nothing really bothers me. I was joking about earlier.
Well,
so don't
I
worry
hope
about that.
you've let it all, because I know I was rough on you, because I accept you. That's why.
Yeah. No, listen, I again, everybody go check out Arlen's website. Go watch his YouTube videos. Go watch,
buy my books. Forget about watching. Buy my books.
I was getting to that.
Not fast enough.
So again, he's got great videos. Get the books he has available. They are very good. I'm going to tell you right now, and I said this to you earlier. Next month is my birthday. I always buy a birthday gift for myself. I will be picking up the Silver Age of comic book art from you. I will buy directly from your website in February. All right. And I will make sure to get that. I will even
tell all your friends and all your other people to buy them too. I'm a freelance artist. It's a jungle out there, Not all of us have day jobs. Lucky you.
And I will get to this book. I want to read this cover to cover at some point, but I am glad I got to read the stuff that you wrote already.
Seriously, watch the episodes, then watch them in the order of the book. You'll get. I guarantee you, Michael, especially as an educator, you'll see there's a method to my madness. Mm-hmm. If you actually do what I say, you'll see how it all come together.
I will give it a try when I get my free time.
Did I mention there will be a test though, both oral and written?
Oh wow, I was never good at tests, but I'll take it. So
read the book, because I'm going to test you on it the next time we talk about it.
I will. So we'll never talk about it again. And but yeah. So anyway, I'm gonna let you go. You can hang out. After the show for a few minutes. I'd love to chat a little more. And for my audience next week, I have I'm just looking. I got Matthew Hansel coming on. So if you guys follow comics, if you read A Kid in a Comic, which I forgot to advertise at the beginning of the show, but A Kid in the Comic newspaper, all comics. My character, who's behind me, the Whimsical Wiz, does appear in it. and he has his comic in there. Does a bunch of great stuff. You're gonna love his work, his style. I could sit and talk to him for an hour just about inking comics. We'll see what happens. But next week, Matthew Hansel, 9 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you to Arlen Schumer. It really was a pleasure. I had a lot of fun. I do want you to come back. We will talk more, and we will definitely
Thanks for having me on.
Talk Twilight Zone again.
And other things.
Yes, I know, but we are definitely talking comics next time. But
Absolutely.
Twilight Zone maybe off the air. All right, guys. I will see you guys soon. If I get a chance, maybe I'll do a live stream drawing this weekend. I don't know. Yeah. Thanks for watching, you guys. See you later.
Bye.